No.
Oh, no. The traffic here does not even begin to compare. I would drive through LA at 2 o'clock in the morning and it would still be bumper to bumper.
Yes,
The traffic there is like the traffic here when there's crashes.
Except when there are crashes there, it's even worse.
No.
Yeah. Anyway, moving on from our discussion of Los Angeles, it's time to talk Torah. Yes. So I want to work on a term to make sure that we have this in clear understanding before we start. Theft. What does it mean to steal something? What is theft? Okay, right. So that means you take, and it means that the ownership is not yours.
Without consent.
Right? And no consent. Right? Because if you take it, then nothing is actually moved, right? That's actually what we would call coveting, although we've talked about in the past that the term covet in Hebrew probably implied some form of taking that was short of theft, but still illegitimate. If it's already yours, then you're allowed to take it. And if the person gives their consent, then we call that borrowing, right? So you really have to hit these key things for theft to occur. And what happens once something's been stolen? Why is this wrong? I'll start with that first. Why is theft wrong? Okay, because the Torah tells us not to, right? I should again point out that there is considerable disagreement on whether the commandment in the Ten Commandments that is usually translated as "don't steal" actually talking about stealing stuff. There is a considerable body of opinion, especially among traditional commentaries of the sages, that says that particular verse is talking about stealing people. That is to say, kidnapping. Because the context in which it is listed, the other crimes in which it is surrounded are capital offenses, adultery and murder. Whereas theft is never, under any circumstances, ever punishable by capital punishment, which is unlike just about every other legal code in the ancient world and all the way up into the modern world in many countries, where theft was punished in certain extreme cases and sometimes even in small cases by killing people. That's why there's a British expression, hang for a lamb, hang for a sheep, which basically means if they're going to kill you because you stole a lamb, you might as well steal an entire sheep. Yeah, I know. It's one of those real happy expressions from a more cheerful time of British history where they could catch you and hang you because you stole someone's sheep. And Judaism, and that was almost up into the modern period. And Judaism has said no from the very beginning. That is not the punishment for theft. We'll talk about what the punishment for theft is. So yes, the idea of do not steal in the Ten Commandments may be better defined as do not steal people, and then do not steal itself for property is most likely to be found in our own Torah portion of Mishpatim, which is a wonderful smorgasbord of different commandments and different rules, and gets down into the nitty-gritty of what does it mean to make the Torah real, make commandments of the Ten Commandments so beautiful, so elevated, so wonderful. Not a lot of specifics in the Ten Commandments. This is where we start drilling into some details, getting down to brass tacks, as they say, and figuring out how this is going to work. So with that in mind, we'll save some of our other questions for later on. We're going to be on chapter 22 of the book of Exodus, which in the Eitz Chaim is on page 464, right near the bottom.
Oh.
And we're actually going to start just at the end of chapter 21, which is verse 37. And then we're going to go right into chapter 22, verse 1. It's a continuation of the same theme and just easier to do it that way. Everyone fine where we are? We're on verse 37. When a man
steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep.
All right. So you steal someone's ox or sheep and it's no longer with you, so therefore you cannot return the item that you stole. you have to pay a penalty. And the penalty scales. It's 4 for a sheep and 5 for an oxen. There are various attempts to explain why the Torah chose to have a slightly different penalty for the two. One of my favorites is the idea that because the oxen will be led with you, it's not as humiliating to steal an ox, whereas the sheep you have to carry, which is a more shameful act, and therefore you've already paid part of your penalty by having to be exposed and be embarrassed by your act of theft. You couldn't just walk along carrying, leading a cow.
I think also the ox is used as a horsepower.
Very much, yes. It is.
Energy.
Yes, it is.
And it's more useful.
Historically, it did have a higher farm utility. Yes.
So it's worth more than the sheep.
True, but the fact that it's worth more doesn't mean that the penalty should be higher, right? Because if it's worth 100 and the sheep is worth 50, and if we multiplied both of them by the same amount, the penalty for stealing an ox would still be much higher than the penalty for stealing a sheep, because the multiplication would multiply the base value. So adding in an additional multiple is throwing something else into the mix. It's not just talking about its core expensiveness. All right. However, when talking about thievery, and now we're on 22:1.
Oh, there's one.
If the
If
thief,
the thief is seized while tunneling and he is beaten to death, there is no blood guilt in his case. If the sun has risen on him, there is blood guilt in that case.
all right. So we're gonna pause there because this was a slight digression
Yeah.
to try and say, well, what happens if you are, in your house and all of a sudden some guy comes through the window, right? Or because the houses were often made of plaster and mud, as well as sometimes other types of stone, it was possible for a person to sort of like chisel through the back wall relatively easily. In the modern days, you need a chainsaw to do this. Back then, it was a little easier. So somebody breaks into the house. Well, if they break into the house and it is night, and as they come in, you retaliate and you stop the person, but in stopping them, you kill them. You, the homeowner, are considered free of charge, right? You have not slaughtered this person. You have simply defended yourself. Whereas if it's daylight and the person comes through, and I should point out that Jewish law explains that this means the person does not appear to be armed because it's daylight and you can see this, and you stop them with lethal force, you are considered to have committed manslaughter against this person. Even though it was your house, even though they were coming in illegally, you do not get to just murder someone for being on your property. You only get to defend your life with lethal force if your life is in danger, not your property, right? So this is a very different standard than is used in American law, with the idea of castle doctrine and stand your ground and all of the other things that have been discussed. This is saying you only get to use lethality when it is clear that there is lethal intention against you. The nighttime, by the way, as a condition, is not only about whether you can see the person as using lethal threat or not, but the idea that when a person breaks into a house at night, they expect to find the owner at home. And when they break into a house at night and they know the owner was going to be home, they expect the owner to defend himself. And if they expect the owner to defend himself, they are preparing to use violence against the owner. Whereas somebody who sneaks into a house in the middle of the day, at least in the classic sense, wouldn't expect to find anyone home because they'd be out in the farm or doing their job or whatever, and they expected the house to be empty. And so they didn't have a clear intention to commit violence just by stealing stuff from your house. They weren't trying to hurt anyone, right? They were a cat burglar. They weren't a robber, to use sort of English terms that might give us some context. Does that make sense? Okay. But back to the whole thieving and restitution.
So if the sun has risen on him, there is blood guilt in that case. He must make restitution. If he lacks the means, he shall be sold for his theft. But if what he stole, whether ox or ass or sheep, is found alive in his possession, he shall pay double.
Right. You don't just hand back what you stole, because if you did that, there would be no penalty, and you might as well try, because the worst that can happen is you just have to give it back. So there has to be a penalty. And notice the important idea that if you cannot afford to pay back the double remuneration or multiples of that, if it was not in your possession anymore, you get sold. right? You, the thief, right? You are sold. There's no such concept as prison in Jewish law. Right? They had jail, which is where they would hold a person while the trial was happening and while evidence was gathered and all of that. But once sentence was passed, they didn't put you in a room somewhere where you just sat for years and years and years. The idea of imprisonment as punishment is a foreign concept in Jewish law, and indeed in most ancient forms of legal codes. The idea of sticking somebody in a room as imprisonment as a form of punishment, totally weird.
Yeah.
And really, that's a very modern Western European invention that was originally designed primarily by people who thought they were going to fix people who were bad by putting them in places where they would rehabilitate them. And then they decided that wasn't working out so well. But you know what? Imprisoning people and taking away their freedom, that's a form of punishment anyway. So let's just keep doing that. So that's sort of where we ended up with our penal system. But Judaism would be boggled by the idea of putting somebody into a room for 5 years as some form of extensive timeout punishment.
The rule about selling somebody who can't pay that particular penalty, does that also apply to prior cases of stealing the ox and stealing the sheep?
Yes,
It doesn't have
for
the 5 to pay.
for any
It will
penalty.
be sold.
For any penalty, right? So if you cheat someone in your business dealings and you cannot afford to pay the penalty the court imposes upon you, again, you could be sold in order to pay off that debt. And this was the primary form in which someone might become what in English would probably better be rendered an indentured servant in Jewish communities in the ancient world. Thieves or people who had committed fraud, or people in some cases who had just hit incredibly bad luck financially would sell themselves voluntarily just to have a place where they knew they could eat and they knew they had a roof over their head. And they were willing to give up their freedom just to guarantee their non-starvation. It was not the ideal. That's why the Torah much later on goes into extensive discussion of how we prevent people from getting to that state. But for these people who sort of brought it on themselves, this was the form of punishment that they had to deal with. And of course, we'll hear in other parts of Mishpatim and elsewhere in the Torah, that doesn't mean we get to abuse the person who is serving out their time, right? They are paying off a debt, a financial debt that came from their theft. They're not paying off a moral failing, and therefore we don't get to, abuse them. We don't get to knock out their teeth and things like that. In fact, if we do, they go free.
2 questions. Does this penalty only apply if there's intent for theft, or is it any kind of theft?
If there's no intent, like if you accidentally take the wrong coat off the hanger when you're leaving, from and because it looked like your coat and you walk out the door with it, then most courts would not hold you liable for theft. They would just hold you liable for grabbing the wrong coat. So there needs to be an intentionality behind it. This is permanently. I knew it was someone else's and I was taking it for me.
All right. Just have a question. Does the indentured servitude, does that only apply to debt that's supposed to be punitive, or is that any debt?
It can be any debt, but the court is always very reluctant to force somebody who's in debt for other reasons to go into indentured servitude unless there was no other way for them to clear their debt.
So if they became a servant or a slave or whatever we're going to call these people, who decided how long to pay back whatever it is?
There's a more complicated formula to work out exactly how much they still owe and how much their labor is worth, and therefore how much of that is going to be used to offset the debt that they have for their crime. So the court would be the ones that would work that out.
But it's not going to be for a lifetime.
No. I mean, it's impossible for it to be a lifetime in any event, because every jubilee, anybody who
7
is
years?
49, right? They would absolutely be freed.
That's a long time.
Well, if you stole something that was so expensive that it was going to take you 49 years to work off, you shouldn't have been stealing it. Right? Or, you should have had enough money to buy it rather than, or to pay off the debt that you were exposed to. It's a good reason not to steal.
How come the 7th year doesn't clear the debt? The 7th year.
The 7th year would clear a financial debt, right? So if I borrow $500 from you and the 7th year comes around and the $500 debt would be cleared, but it doesn't clear a criminal debt, right? Because the criminal debt needs to be repaid to the person. And in fact, there is no longer a debt here, right? Once you have been sold, the value is transferred to the person who deserves the payment, there's no longer a debt, right? You've paid your debt by handing it over, and now you're working off that indentured servitude, right? So the debt itself has been zeroed. All right, a little more.
When a man lets his livestock loose to graze in another's land, and so allows a field or a vineyard to be grazed bare, he must make restitution for the impairment of that field or vineyard.
All right, so why is this law being discussed here? About your animals eating someone else's
It's
food?
essentially you are stealing food for your animals.
Exactly, right? I know most of us are not farmers, and we don't think about how much it costs to feed a cow, but it costs quite a lot to feed a cow. And even if you're not buying, barrels of cow food, you need room, land to feed a cow, and whatever that cow eats, another cow can't eat. I know that sounds a little obvious, but we got to make sure we're clear on this. So therefore, letting my cow eat your field is stealing the value of your field and putting it into my cow and turning it into more cow meat or milk or whatever I'm doing with my cow. So that is a form of theft, right? I am taking something that doesn't belong to me, and you did not agree to that. And therefore, it is a type of theft. It's just I'm using my cow's mouth to take rather than my own hand. Make sense?
Was there such an agreement as leasing land?
Absolutely. Lots of ways where you can lease and you can give special use rights, and you can sell how much time the person's allowed to use your land, and you can even come up with just trades of you can use my land and I can use yours, and we'll call it even. Anything that you and the other landowner agree on, now we have consent. Do what you like.
Now, is this back even in antiquity?
Oh, they had quite complicated usage regulations back in antiquity. They were no slouches. They could come up with very complicated ways of being fair to all the parties involved. Up to and including, however much this, how long with this and how long in this, we'll split the cow when it's slaughtered, and I'll get this percentage and you'll get that, but this is worth more than this part of the cow, so that means I'll get these parts of the meat and this. They get down into the gristle to handle all of these things, or you could say down into the weeds. Onward.
When a fire is started and spreads to thorns so that standing or growing grain is consumed, he who started the fire must make restitution.
All right. So although we're assuming there's no intention in this case, we can see that it is still akin to the idea of theft, because the fire that I created has caused you to no longer have what you used to own, right? It has burnt up your property. I didn't.
My grandfather did that once.
Really?
By mistake.
Whoops. Well, presumably.
It just
right.
went out of control, and he had to go out and he had to make sure that the neighbors. It's a part of the neighbors, not the whole thing.
Right.
But it was still he did restitution.
Exactly, because if you did it on purpose, that's called arson, and that's a different type of crime than doing it. Oops. But in either case, I have taken something from you, even if I don't have it now. I have still deprived you of ownership of that product.
Yeah, I just read yesterday that Pacific Gas and Electric is going into bankruptcy so that they don't have to pay
Yes.
for their
Mistakes.
Oh, for the-
mistake in the
fire.
that took out Paradise City. So all those people
Have no legal recourse against the company that caused the fire.
Oh. Yeah.
The
Kathy, let's-
10 cents on a dollar kind of, it's, so there's a big thing in California over the fact that they're doing
I can imagine.
the biggest gas and electric in the country.
Or it was.
It was.
Yeah.
Well, it's soon to be bankrupt.
Or soon to be reestablished under a different name, but
That's
having no liability for the original problem.
Right,
Yeah.
right, that's what's gonna happen, and we know.
So the fire starter wouldn't be allowed to be an indentured servant then, right? Because there's no intent?
No, it's still, if you started a fire even accidentally and it spread and destroyed way too much that you can't afford to make restitution,
Right.
then you would have to work off your debt. I mean, you would have to be sold to work for your debt.
And you wouldn't get, it wouldn't be forgiven in the seventh year either, right?
No, but again, there are other ways to pay off debts, right? This is assuming like, you are absolutely broke, homeless, and you're smoking, and you cause a fire that burns up someone else's property. So there's no way for you to compensate that. If you're another farmer, then chances are you will have other property or other resources that you can use to make restitution. So it's the idea of being sold as an indentured servant is really the last ditch effort to make sure that the person whose property was harmed is still going to receive the remuneration. But there would have been many other ways of selling your animals, selling other produce, selling other equipment, selling property. There were lots of other things a person could do to make restitution before they had to sell themselves.
Yeah.
Okay. And
when a man gives money or goods to another for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the man's house, if the thief is caught, he shall pay double.
All right, so understand here what we're trying to say is, what happens when someone takes it, and it's mine, and I didn't give consent, but it wasn't with me when it was taken? What if it was with, Frank? Frank was holding on to my fancy cow, and then my cow went missing. So how does that work? Well, if I catch the thief and he's got my cow, then obviously Frank is off the hook, and Mr. Thief, that's pretty clear, right? However,
if the thief is not caught, the owner of the house shall depose before God that he has not laid hands on the other's property.
Right, because the suspicion might be that there never was a theft and Frank just ate my cow. And this I can't prove. Right. So the way that it is proved in the lack of any evidence, and again, if there is evidence one way or the other, like two people come forward and say, Frank eating your cow, that makes this a different case. But if there's no evidence or proof that Frank ate the cow, but there's still room to believe it could have disappeared into Frank, then Frank has to go before the Kohanim, and he has to, and before the Beit Din, he has to swear that he did not. And swearing is much more than taken much more seriously than people use the phrase nowadays, right? This meant really that they were witnessing before God that what they had done was proper and correct, and they had not touched the cow at all, and that they were really willing to stake their statement against punishment by God for what they were claiming, and they took that very, very seriously. And so then, yes, then we believe them. If they were willing to swear that oath, then we were willing to believe them, absent any other evidence to the contrary.
In all charges of misappropriation pertaining to an ox, an ass, a sheep, a garment, or any other loss, whereof one party alleges this is it, the case of both parties shall come before God. He whom God declares guilty shall pay double to the other.
All right, which basically means that you have to have a trial, right? And if there's a disagreement of that's my cow, no, that's my cow, right? And one side must be wrong, and again, not just mistaken, but is deliberately trying to claim ownership of something that they know isn't theirs. Well, once that's settled in a court, then that is also considered a type of attempted theft of the person claiming property that isn't theirs. And this is to prevent people from using a fictitious ownership claim in order to steal from someone else. And again, if there was no penalty for this, then I could just go around saying, that's mine, that's mine, that's mine, that's mine, that's mine. And, eventually the court's going to give me one of them. And what's the harm in just doing that over and over again? Well, the harm is you're ending up paying double if you're making these claims and it's proven false. Make sense? Okay. Is a big deal. And theft was a big problem in the ancient world. Theft nowadays is not as big of a problem on the day-to-day level. I would imagine that most of you here have not stolen something from someone, or if you did, you might have been very young and innocent and silly. And I would also be willing to wager that most of you have probably not had something stolen, again, on average. Most of us are fairly secure in our property in a way that is unusual in human history. We are not constantly fearful of theft. Now, there are other types of theft, and we all know that there are issues of, fraud and issues of deception within institutions and things like that. Wells Fargo, I know, got hit hard when it turned out that they had been hitting their customers rather hard by putting on fees and other things that no one had ever agreed to. So there are those types of ethereal thefts that are more common now than, of course, ever before, because they didn't exist before. But there is another type of theft that was commonplace in the past and is really common now. And that is called stealing people's minds, right? This is, what? No, this is the Jewish concept of deception, of what does it mean to lie, right? Lying we know is forbidden, of course. And I'll refer you to my last Pathway to Judaism class where I go into more detail about what lying means. But Judaism doesn't only describe lying as bad because you didn't tell the truth. Judaism also describes lying as bad because of the overall structure in which a person, you told the truth or not. It's about what impression did you make and how did you manipulate other people and a situation to your advantage in ways that are not right. And so we're going to see both how Judaism talks about this, as well as a particularly bad episode of this. So we're going to begin from the Megillah. Again, one of the early midrashim, midrashim on the book of Shemot, Exodus.
If it will be found in his hand. There are 7 thefts: stealing men's minds, that is, deceiving them; one's neighbor to be his guest when he has no intention of inviting him.
Now, notice that's considered stealing, right? If you invite someone to come over and you know that that person will not accept, right? Then that is a type of theft, right? You have tricked them, you have deceived them, you're pretending to be hospitable, and in fact, you know that there is no chance of this ever really going through at the outlay. Hospitality was and should still be considered a very important virtue, and therefore one that you wanted to have other people think of you, but a lot of people didn't want to actually pony up the cash to freely give other people stuff, whether it be food, a place to live or sleep, and whatever else they might need. So there's a lot of social credit by offering hospitality, out of incentive not to go through with it. So if you could find a way to thread that needle of saying, oh, sure, you could come, why don't you come tonight, when you know that person can't come tonight and you're definitely not going to ask them to come tomorrow night, that is a form of theft. You are stealing goodwill that you don't deserve.
Offering gifts that he will not be accepted.
Which is a similar type of thing of, here, have this diamond necklace. It's like, no, I can't. It's like, oh, okay. The person is not going to take it, but you still get the credit for having offered it.
They really should take it and say thank you.
That's the best way to teach a person not to do that. Why, thank you. I'll take that Ferrari.
Opening one's barrels, that is ostensibly for him alone, when they have already been sold to the shopkeeper.
Right, so the barrels are already meant to be put into use, but you're acting like you're only opening it up for their benefit. And therefore, it's like, wow, you're opening up this whole keg for me? It's like, yeah. It's like it already been agreed on. But it makes it look like I'm doing you. So now I'm, again, stealing goodwill from you.
Cheating in measuring.
Yeah, which, again, it's not deliberately reaching over and grabbing someone's wallet, but you are still, because you mismeasure something, ending up with more than you should be in the exchange.
Falsifying weights.
Which is the other way to cheat when you're trying to measure things out.
Mixing other stalks among the stalks of fenugreek.
Right, which was a type of produce, and you would mix in inferior things, and that way you would bulk up what you were selling, and you would be more.
Like mixing sand with the beans.
Again, same thing. You obviously, people aren't going to actually eat the sand, but if you put sand in the bags with the beans, then the weighs more. Exactly. And now when you charge by weight, you're going to be able to charge them for more.
Or mixing vinegar with oil.
Again, because you are mixing 2 different things, one of which will make it look like you have more of the other.
And what is more, they say about such a person that if he could steal the higher mind, he would do so.
All right, so what they mean by steal the higher mind, they mean if they could cheat God, they would. Wow. Right, so we're talking about stealing minds, right? They're stealing other human beings' minds, and then they're stealing God's mind. If you could trick God, if you could deceive God, you would. Meaning if you will trick a person, you would probably try to trick God if you could. Now, obviously you can't, but we're going to see an example of how that plays out.
And thus do we find with Absalom that he stole 3 thefts. He stole the heart of his father, the heart of Beit Din, and the heart of the house of Israel, because it's written in Samuel, and Absalom stole the heart of the men of Israel.
All right, so just quick, we're going to get into more of the tale of Absalom in a couple, in one more paragraph. But who was he?
He was the son of-
The son of David, or David's sons. He had quite a few.
He connived to crown himself king while David was still alive, and
More than just
led a revolt against
led
his father.
a full-on revolution
Led a
against
full
his father.
revolution, tried to kill his own father. And
Right.
his-
After having murdered his brother,
Right.
who had raped his sister. So, I mean, this was a messed up family.
But he was good looking
He had a
And red
hair.
and
And he had-
charisma.
He had a head of hair you could die for.
You could actually-
And if you know the story, you know that's a joke.
Yeah.
We'll see that a little bit more later on. So we're going to get more into Absalom in a minute, but I wanted to make sure you understood the idea that one of the things he did to lead the revolt was he deceived the nation into supporting him, right? And that's what their midrash is playing off here, is that he tricked the country to support him. But we have another question in the meantime,
Who is the greater, the robber or the robbed?
right? Who basically, like, who's worse in this? And now you might think, but wait, how can you say the person who was robbed would be worse? Explanation.
The person who is robbed, because he knows that he is being robbed and he remains silent.
All right. So here we're talking about not the kind of stealing wallet robbery. Here we're talking about the mind being stolen, being tricked, being deceived. And what it's trying to say is that when someone has been tricked or deceived, very often they'll know that they're being deceived, but they'll choose to go along with it anyway, right? It will be pleasant deception. They want to have someone trick them. They want to be deceived. And many people have ended up in very ultimately unhappy relationships because they wanted to believe something about the other person. You know, okay, fine. But it was just easier to go along with the lie than it was to actually force the person to tell the truth. And so too, you know, we know that during the rise of Hitler's power in Germany before World War II, many people knew that what he was saying was a lie, but it made them feel good to imagine Germany strong again, to imagine their country as taking its place in the world stage again. They wanted what he said to be true, and so they went along with it. And so even though the deceiver may seem like the worst person, it's the people who allow the deception to perpetuate that are in many ways worse. Except now we're going to flip that on its head.
Thus do we find with our fathers that when they stood on Mount Sinai, they sought to steal the higher mind,
Meaning God, right? They tried to trick God.
as it's written in Exodus.
From this week's Torah portion,
They said, everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do and we will hear. As it was, and it was, as it were, stolen by them.
meaning when they swore to God that they would do the commandments,
They hadn't heard it yet.
no, they had.
Yeah.
They were lying through their teeth. Absolutely, God, we'll do it. Like, you have no intention of following the commandments. How do we know? Because as soon as Moses' back is turned, you're building a golden cow.
Oh,
I mean, and throughout the rest of the journey through the desert, you guys have shown yourself over and over and over again to lack true commitment to the following of Torah. So there's one way to answer that, which is to say they were committed for that moment and then they backslide. And this particular midrash is saying, no, they wanted God to think that they were wholehearted in their devotion, but they themselves knew in their heart that they were lacking in the true conviction necessary to make that statement, and they said it anyway.
What would be the motive to lie about that, though?
God would accept them and continue to protect and help them.
But he would know they were lying.
no.
They got different.
No.
So this is why we're talking about, if you could, would you try to trick God, right? And a lot of people think they can pull one over on God, right? That they can somehow work the system, say the right words, do the right act, and God won't notice all the other bad stuff.
It's kind of with Elijah with the priest of Baal.
Yeah.
The
It's unfortunately a very common human trait. What's the the old joke where they're walking along the beach, the grandmother and the little boy, right? And the wave comes and sweeps the little boy out into the sea. And the grandmother says, "Oh God, please save him, bring him back to me. Please, God, I'll do anything. I'll make a huge donation to the shul." The wave washes the boys back up and he says, "Don't worry, God, it's okay. I don't need the help now."
Oh,
Like, wait a minute.
But he had a hat.
That's another one too. Yes,
Yes.
yeah. There's a couple versions of the beach walking. Yes, but there's a lot of people that will make promises to God, and then once God has fulfilled His side of the promise, they'll act as though they never made the promise, or that it wasn't God that fulfilled the promise. It's, oh no, I took care of it myself, and therefore they renege. But they pretend like they didn't, and they think that they're somehow pulling a fast one.
the one I heard somebody say, you're driving this crowded streets. Oh God, please help me find a parking space. Help me. And a guy pulls out in front of him and says, "Never mind, God, I just found one."
Same sentiment. Exactly. All right. So how do we know that this was a bit of a failure?
Because it's written in Devarim, would that this heart of theirs were in them to fear me and to keep all my mitzvot all of the days.
Right. Meaning God knew in their hearts that they were not really prepared to make that statement, but they did it anyway. Now, again, this is different ways of reading this section. Some are more positive and say the people wanted to, and so they made the declaration. Others, like particular Midrash, say the people knew that they were not going to live up to it, but they made a bold oath anyway, to their detriment. Onward.
And if you would say that not all is revealed and known to God,
Because maybe you don't believe that God knows what's in the heart of everybody.
it's written in Psalms, and they beguiled God with their mouths, and their hearts were not constant with God.
Right. So sure, blah, blah, blah. They tried to say the wrong words or the right words, but wrongly. But in their heart, it was clear that they were not fooling anyone.
In spite of which, it says, and God was merciful, forgiving sin and not destroying, etc. And it's written in Mishlei, as silver dross covering earthenware are lips running with love above an evil heart.
Right. For people who say all sorts of wonderful, wonderful things, it's like silver around the earthenware, around clay. It's like a silver lining around the outside, but really it's just only underneath, and it will break and fall apart. So yeah, that's what deception is like. All right, so let's get the story of Absalom a little bit here.
Okay, sometime afterwards, Absalom provided himself with a chariot, horses, and 50 outrunners. Absalom used to rise early and stand by the road to the city gates.
Why is he by the city gates? That's where people came for judgment, right, for their cases.
And whenever a
This
man,
was in the ancient world, the city.
The city gates would have been, well, he would have been with the elders judging.
Well, he was outside the city gates.
Before
So
they
he-
got to the elders.
Exactly. You have to imagine he's on the steps of the courthouse, would be the modern metaphor, right? So he's on the steps of the courthouse. He is greeting people as they're coming in to bring their case before the court and before the king. Oh, yeah.
so he'd stand by the road to the city gates, and whenever a man had a case that was to come before the king for judgment,
Which is Absalom's father.
Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" And when he answered, "Your servant is from such and such a tribe in Israel," Absalom would say to him, "It is clear that your claim is right and just, but there is no one assigned to you by the king to hear it." So Absalom went on, "Oh, if only I were appointed judge in the land and everyone with a legal dispute came before me, I would see that he got his rights." And if a man approached to bow to Absalom, Absalom would extend his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. Absalom did this to every Israelite who came to the king for judgment, and thus Absalom won away the hearts of the men of Israel.
Or literally stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So notice what he's doing here, right? He is standing at the near the entrance, and people are coming with problems, with cases, with litigation, and he is stopping them before they get to the gates, before they can get redress, and saying, you know what? There's no one in there who's going to listen to a guy like you. I'm sorry, but the courts are not for you. You will not be heard. If only I were a judge, which of course he wasn't, because his father was still not exactly 100% reconciled to him, what with murdering his other son. And he had been in exile for a number of years before being brought back. He is instead trying to shift everyone to believe that there is no justice for them in David's court. And that means that they are now going to be angrier and angrier and angrier with David and with the current level of justice, because he is preventing them from getting justice. While claiming that he would give them more justice, he is keeping them from getting any justice. And that is exacerbating the tensions in the country. Right? It is a very shrewd political move. Right? You deliberately break a system in order to have people be angry, and then you promise to fix the system. But notice how his fix is actually impossible, because he is telling everybody, I would decide you're right, right? You're absolutely right, buddy. That neighbor of yours who took that part of that field, you're right. He shouldn't have taken it. And if I were a judge, I'd be giving it back to you. And in the meantime, he's telling the other neighbor, you're absolutely right. You have every right to that piece of the field of your neighbor. And if I were a judge, I'd make sure he didn't get a thing. He's saying everything to everybody, saying that they're right, which in litigation is not possible. Right? As anybody who's ever trial will know, you can't have both sides of a litigation be correct. You can have them be partially correct, sure, but not 100% correct, or else they wouldn't be in court. So he is very shrewdly setting up a system where he is gaining support for himself without having to do anything other than talk. He's not actually helping anyone. All he is doing is talking, and his talk is stealing away the hearts of the people.
After a period.
Sorry. Thank you for pointing that out, because that is a very important part. He's sympathizing with them, right? He is being very friendly, right? Most people think of the king as being, this high and mighty, which David certainly was. Absalom is saying, no, here, let me kiss you. Don't just bow in front of me. He is pulling them to him. He is saying, where are you from? He wants to know about them. He is really being a very folksy kind of guy. And you're right, that sympathizing with them, that empathizing with them, which clearly is false, is going a long way towards getting him the support of the nation. And it is very sad to see how this happens.
After a period of 40 years had gone by.
That does not mean that he'd been doing this for 40 years, right? The commentators are usually quite unanimous that this is talking about 40 years after the time when the people asked for a king, which is basically going back to the original prophecy of Samuel, when Samuel was told all the nation, you want a king? You know what a king is going to be like? It's going to be horrible. Now, 40 years later, we're going to see the real break point of what he meant.
This was also 40 years after they'd broken the habit of everybody being right in.
To their own way, yes, exactly. And also their own local judge among their own
In many ways, he
tribe.
must have made them great like they were again.
Did David rule 40 years?
David did, which is why we know this can't be a measure of Absalom's life, because that would have been the extent of David's kingship. And this doesn't happen in the last year of David's life. So, which is why we have to rely on the commentators who say, no, this measurement of time is going from the beginning of Samuel's prediction, when the people came to him asking for a king, when he predicted your king is going to end up corrupt and terrible. This is now going to see one of the worst examples. Remember, Saul was not corrupt. He just wasn't exactly willing to dedicate himself fully to what God was asking. And David, we know from his story with Bathsheba, was mostly, again, not corrupt, but had some lapses. Absalom is representing the perfect example of what a wicked king would be like, of manipulative, deceptive, and destructive.